We're asked to give the equations of any vertical or horizontal asymptotes for the graph of the rational function, and then they give us the function f of x is equal to 3x minus 4 over x squared minus 36. To find any vertical asymptotes, we know that the vertical asymptotes occur where the denominator is equal to 0. So we can set the denominator equal to 0. That's the bottom. So the x squared minus 36. Set it equal to 0 and then solve for x. Well, to solve this, we can either factor it. It is a difference of two squares, so you can factor it, or you can use the square root property since it doesn't have that middle term. There's no bx term, so the square root property will work as well. So to use the square root property, we need to isolate the x squared first. When we isolate the x squared, we're going to move the 36 to the other side to get the x squared by itself. We get x squared is equal to 36. And then we can undo the x squared by taking the square root of both sides. And so we're going to take the square root of both sides. Now on the left, the square root of x squared is just x. But on the right, anytime we're taking a square root, we have to remember that we end up with two answers. We end up with plus or minus 6 in this case, because a positive 6 squared gives us 36, and a negative 6 squared also gives us 36. So anytime we're taking the square root, we have to remember there are two answers. And so we end up with two vertical asymptotes here, one at x equals 6 and one at x equals negative 6. To find the horizontal asymptotes, that's where we had to compare the degrees of the numerator and the denominator. So determining the degrees, the numerator, the largest exponent we have on any variable, well, the only variable we have is the x, and it doesn't have an exponent written, which means we understand that that's an exponent of 1. X to the first power is x. And so because it has an exponent of 1, that's the highest degree, the highest exponent, so the numerator has a degree of 1. For the denominator, the highest exponent we have is a squared. And so we notice that the denominator degree is 2. That's the highest exponent there. And so now we're comparing those two numbers. Well, anytime you're comparing two numbers, only three things can happen. Either the first number is bigger, or the second number is bigger, or the two numbers are equal. Those are the only three things that can happen. Either the first one's bigger, or the second one's bigger, or they're the same. So we have a rule that tells us the horizontal asymptote in each of those cases. If the first number is bigger, if the n, the degree at the top, is bigger than the degree of the bottom, then we have no horizontal asymptote. If the n is smaller, if the degree of the numerator is smaller than the degree of the denominator, then we have y equals 0 as our horizontal asymptote, the x-axis. And if they're equal, if the two degrees are equal, then we get the leading coefficient of the numerator over the leading coefficient of the denominator. So we call those a sub n and b sub m. And so you write them as a ratio. So y equal the leading coefficient of the top over the leading coefficient of the bottom would be our horizontal line, our horizontal asymptote in this case. And so looking at the numbers we have, n is 1, m is 2. So we know that n is less than m. So we're using this middle rule here. And when n is less than m, we know that we have a horizontal asymptote of y equals 0. So all we need to do now is enter those into MyMathLab. Well, notice we've got two options. For the first part of the answer, we're asked for the equations of any vertical asymptotes. Our first option is x equal, and then our second option is there is no vertical. Well, we notice that we do have two vertical asymptotes, so it's not option B. It has to be answer choice A. And then it asks us to use a comma to separate our answers, so we can enter those as 6, and then a comma, and then negative 6. Same thing for the horizontal asymptotes. It's not going to be answer choice B because we do have a horizontal. We found it to be y equals 0. So we select answer choice A and we enter y equals 0. And those are our asymptotes. Oh, the 0 didn't take 0. There we go.